Well, Jeffrey Epstein is back in the news. The United States government released over 23,000 documents related to him, most of them emails, letters, and court depositions. I looked through all of them, and these are the 25 most interesting things that I found in them. The first is that Jeffrey Epstein and the people around him frequently alluded to having some kind of dirt on President Donald Trump. The emails span from before he first became president to 2019 when Jeffrey Epstein died. This document from 2011 is an email from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell. You can see her name right there, G Max. And Jeffrey Epstein says, "I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Virginia," meaning Virginia Roberts, "spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. The police chief, etc. I'm 75% there." Now, I'm not quite sure what he means by "I'm 75% there," but Ghislaine Maxwell responds, "I've been thinking about that, ... In this email from Mark Epstein, who's Jeffrey Epstein's younger brother, Mark Epstein initially asks Jeffrey about being possibly pre-diabetic, and then he asks, "What is your boy Donald up to now?" Jeffrey responds, "All good. Bannon with me," meaning Steve Bannon, one of the former advisors to Donald Trump. And Mark Epstein says, "Ask him if Putin has the photos of Trump and Bubba," alluding to some sort of illicit encounter. On top of that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Jeffrey Epstein strikes up a sort of friendship with Landon Thomas Jr., who at the time was a reporter for the New York Times, reporting on business and markets. And Jeffrey Epstein offers him photos of Donald Trump. He says, quote, "Would you like photos of Donald and girls in bikinis in my kitchen?" It's unclear if those photos were actually sent. Obviously, they weren't included in this set of documents, or else you would have heard about it on the news. But Landon Thomas does respond in a manner that suggests, to me at least, that he expected that those photos would be coming. On October 13th, 2016, Mark Epstein sends Jeffrey Epstein another email containing a full-sized image of Donald Trump that says, "Would you trust this man with your daughter?" And finally, there's Michael Wolff, who is a New York journalist. He's written a lot of books on Donald Trump, generally from a negative standpoint. But as we'll get into later, he was quite cozy with Jeffrey Epstein, had an extensive friendship over many years, and exchanged many emails. In this one, he strongly urges Jeffrey Epstein to come out with information about Donald Trump a week before the 2016 election. Now, reading through these emails, it's really not clear to me that Jeffrey Epstein had information on Donald Trump. They certainly hinted to it. However, Jeffrey Epstein tended to exaggerate aspects of his life and be sort of deceptive about the people that he knew in order to angle for information and connections to new people. So I'm not sure how much stock I would put in that. That might also explain the next point, which is that Jeffrey Epstein seems partly to have hated Trump, which has been covered extensively in the news, but the aspect that has been almost completely ignored by the mainstream news is that he was often willing to defend and support him. Around the middle of Donald Trump's first presidential term, Jeffrey Epstein texts an anonymous person and says, "I'd really like Donald to triumph. If there's something you think I can do to help, let me know." In these text logs, Jeffrey Epstein texts someone whose name is redacted. I'm not sure, it might be Steve Bannon. And he sends this person an article by Ann Coulter, who's a prominent right-wing conservative commentator. And the article was negative about Jeffrey Epstein. And Epstein texts, "I'm on her team." The person responds, "She can make you a household name, and not in a positive way." Epstein says, "But I'm not a Democrat." Now, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Jeffrey Epstein obviously was no social conservative. However, he did donate to multiple prominent Republicans and Democrats. And in these emails, you can kind of see him playing both sides. On one hand, he'll be texting Steve Bannon about, wanting to support Donald Trump. And on the other hand, he'll be conversing with high-powered New York City lawyers talking about how bad Donald Trump is. So in honesty, I think it's more likely that Jeffrey Epstein kind of existed outside of politics and didn't quite care so much what happened on the day-to-day as long as his personal life was taken care of. You can see that exact dynamic in these emails between Kathy Remler, who is a former Obama White House counsel, a lawyer, and Jeffrey Epstein. Remler says Trump is so gross, and Jeffrey Epstein responds worse in real life and up close. Then in this email between Jeffrey Epstein and Linda Stone, who's a sort of computer science, Microsoft-adjacent person, Jeffrey Epstein defends Donald Trump against the charges of racism and sexism. Linda Stone says, quote, "Of course, not everybody who voted for Trump is a sexist or a racist, but on some level, they don't care if he is." Then Jeffrey Epstein responds, "He's neither sexist or racist. That's the point, and in fact, the truth. He says things to get elected, and it worked, nothing more. talking heads goofy. And just as an aside, one of the main takeaways from reading 20,000 pages of this guy is that he's a terrible speller. The next takeaway is that Jeffrey Epstein had a team of people led by a man named Al Seckel, who is an atheist thinker, and he liked to make illusions. He's kind of a weird guy. I've never actually come across his name before. But in any case, Al Seckel is leading a team of people who are actively working to manipulate the search engine results around Jeffrey Epstein's name. They do this in a couple ways. One, by downplaying negative articles. You can actually see them discussing how to reduce the reach of an article by a woman named Conchita Sarnov that was published in the Daily Beast and portrayed Jeffrey Epstein in a very negative light. They're actively trying to push that article down to the bottom of the search results and elevate the results of people named Jeffrey Epstein who are not our Jeffrey Epstein. They do this over an extended period of time, providing updates on how it's going, and some of the efforts described in these emails might have actually steered into the illegal. We can see in this email that Al Seckel provides an update to Jeffrey Epstein in 2010 that they attempted to reshape the Wikipedia article around Jeffrey Epstein. He says, quote, "We hacked the site to replace the mugshot and caption and now has an entirely different photo and caption. This was a big success." Further up on the page, he says, "We've stopped the hacking on your wiki site and that was a major effort. Your wiki entry is now pretty tame and bad stuff has been muted, polarized, and pushed to the bottom." A weird twist to this Al Seckel episode is that Seckel actually committed suicide in France. His Wikipedia page says Seckel's body was reportedly found at the bottom of a cliff in July 2015 in France. Next, Jeffrey Epstein had some sort of knowledge about purchasing military equipment. A person whose name is redacted reaches out to him on January 31st, 2013 and says, "Do you understand offset agreements? I got asked to be involved in negotiating some of the deals between Brazil and other countries in regard to the purchase of new fighter jets. What is an offset service provider?" Epstein responds, "Yes, one of the most complex negotiations. They're very strange. Someone buys fighters, but with the fighter money, some must be used for specific third-party items." The person responds, "So the offset provider does what? Negotiation between the parties? Complex. Sounds interesting." Jeffrey Epstein responds, "Brazil has tried to buy fighters in the past. They don't have a lot of money." This aspect of Jeffrey Epstein is one of the most interesting and honestly under-acknowledged. His knowledge of military contracting has been hinted at in previous drops, namely a photo of him with a bunch of African warlords, as well as his numerous connections with different political figures across the globe, which I'll get into in a moment. But the fact that this person who is in a position to negotiate the purchase of fighter pilots between countries comes to Jeffrey Epstein for expertise is, I think, very notable. I think it should be one of the main things that the news investigates. However, we just haven't seen very many people talk about it. Next, we know that many people maintained relationships with Jeffrey Epstein despite his many allegations and actually convictions. However, these emails show that several people reach out to Jeffrey Epstein during his investigations. They're well aware that it's going on, and they're reaching out to ask if he's okay. The first is David Grossoff, who's a sort of neuroscientist, a PhD kind of guy. He reaches out to say, "I hope that the reports that you are set to be released from jail are correct." This is after Jeffrey Epstein pled guilty to procuring a minor for prostitution in Florida. Next is Paul Krasner, who is a sort of notable atheist author. He wishes Jeffrey Epstein well in this email. It's dated 2017 and it reads, "Jeffrey, as a friend, I'm saying my atheist prayers for you. Don't let the bastards frame you, Paul." And finally, in 2011, someone named the Duke, possibly the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, writes, "You okay? These stories are complete and utter fantasy. I don't know and have never met Al Gore. Clinton was never on the island. The telephone book is not mine. It was stolen by my houseman that is currently in prison for doing so." And that brings us to our next revelation, which deserves to be on its own. We've all seen different clips of Bill Gates denying Jeffrey Epstein, saying that he didn't really know him that well. However, in this email, a redacted person says Bill Gates wants to talk to Epstein, but his wife won't let him. This stands in pretty stark contrast to Bill Gates' comment that, quote, "I met him. I didn't have any business relationship or friendship with him." However, the relationship between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein goes way deeper than that comment would seem to suggest. And we can tell by Melinda Gates clearly not liking Bill Gates hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein that their relationship was problematic in some way to her. This next section I could honestly make a huge standalone video about, but we'll go through it very quickly because there's so many details. Jeffrey Epstein was highly tapped in to goings-on really around the world, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, island countries. He knew the leaders and diplomats of many countries way more than the average person would. In one document, he tells a redacted person that he has Africans with helicopters at his house looking for advice, possibly military or government related. In the next, he updates someone possibly from an Arab country, Kuwait, or a Gulf country, and says a prominent political figure in Qatar called Mohammed bin Salman, who has been in the news recently. The next, Jeffrey Epstein says he knew the son of the president of Senegal and set him up with Larry Summers, who's the former Harvard president, who's also been in the news recently. In another one, Jeffrey Epstein tries to arrange dinner between an anonymous person, possibly Steve Bannon, and a Slovak diplomat. In another one, Jeffrey Epstein says he's speaking with his China contacts about politics. Related to that, Jeffrey Epstein says he has 3 China guys and will set up a meeting with Bannon. The next, he advises a redacted person on the Yemeni situation and says he's in contact with multiple people in Yemen. In another one, the Mongolian ambassador to the United Nations reaches out to Jeffrey Epstein and asks if he can meet in Paris. In this one, Jeffrey Epstein messages a man named Anil Ambani, who is an Indian billionaire. He was once the 6th richest person in the world. And they have a very brief exchange regarding an article talking about Narendra Modi, the leader of India. And Jeffrey Epstein, I think, suggests, although his writing is terrible, I think he's suggesting that Israel is the key to mediating U.S.-India relations. However, he says it's not for email, and if you read through these documents, that's a phrase that I would keep your eyes out for because it means that something there is important. And finally, in this email, Jeffrey Epstein advises a man named Sultan Ahmed bin Salayem, who is a member of an extremely prominent Emirati business and political family. He advises him that a Russian bank has purchased a commercial property called Gorod Stolitz, which is a huge mixed-use property, although I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is. But it does demonstrate the depth of knowledge and awareness of global events that Jeffrey Epstein had. Continuing on, there's an extensive and very large biography of Jeffrey Epstein. I'm not quite sure who it was written by, but there are several interesting things in it. The first is that the writer says that Jeffrey Epstein's house is somewhere between Daddy Warbucks and Eyes Wide Shut. Eyes Wide Shut is that Stanley Kubrick movie that many people have already compared Jeffrey Epstein's life to, so it's interesting to see them say that explicitly. The next 2 revelations regard people that Jeffrey Epstein seems to have known. In this email, Jeffrey Epstein tells Lawrence Krauss, who is really one of the most unsavory characters in the Jeffrey Epstein saga. I really get a bad feeling about this guy, but he emails Lawrence Krauss that he can invite Johnny Depp to the island. It's not clear if Johnny Depp took him up on this. I've never seen Johnny Depp's name associated with Jeffrey Epstein in any way. However, Johnny Depp did know Lawrence Krauss, and you can actually find an hour-and-a-half discussion between them online. So that is definitely worth looking up, and I'll link that in the comments. It's also worth noting, and I'm not accusing Johnny Depp of anything, but it's also worth noting that Johnny Depp is quite close with Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia. So it's really incredible the extent to which so many people seem to have known each other from different angles. The next bit of info is that Jeffrey Epstein was quite close with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is really one of the most prominent intellectuals in the United States, certainly. And Chomsky seems to have agreed to be interviewed in a documentary about Jeffrey Epstein. He emails with him back and forth throughout these documents, most of it mundane, but it really does go to show how well they knew each other. And the best demonstration of this is that Noam Chomsky wrote some sort of character reference for Jeffrey Epstein at some point in the past, but this is undated. Noam Chomsky writes, "I met Jeffrey Epstein 6 years ago. We've been in regular contact since with many long and often in-depth discussions about a very wide range of topics, including our own specialties and professional work, but a host of others where we have shared interest. It has been a most valuable experience for me. Further down the page, he says, given the range and depth of his concerns, I suppose I should not have been surprised to discover that Jeffrey has been repeatedly able to arrange, sometimes on the spot, very productive meetings with leading figures in the sciences and mathematics and global politics, people whose work and activities I had looked into, though I had never expected to meet them. Once, when we were discussing the Oslo agreements, Jeffrey picked up the phone and called the Norwegian diplomat who supervised them, leading to a lively interchange. On another occasion, Jeffrey arranged a meeting with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, whose record I had studied carefully and written about. Now, I wish I knew why Noam Chomsky was advocating for Jeffrey Epstein, what circumstances under which this letter was written. However, it's undated and there's no context for it. Moving on, Jeffrey Epstein alludes to connections that he might have had with the Biden-Obama teams before 2016. In this document, he said that he sent an idea to Biden's team privately. And in this document, which he sent to Roger Schenck, who is an AI professor, sort of tech guy, Jeffrey Epstein says that he's having someone from the Obama team over to his house. He also knows Kathy Remler, who, as I said, was the Obama counsel. So I really don't think that this is beyond the realm of possibility. However, the connections to the Obama White House have pretty much been overlooked by most mainstream outlets. Not necessarily that Jeffrey Epstein had close relationships with them, but I haven't even seen anyone talk about the fact that he knew quite a few people from that environment. Next, we talked about this a little bit, but that Michael Wolff, the New York journalist that I mentioned earlier, advised Jeffrey Epstein extremely heavily. For years, they went back and forth. Now, I'm sure that there were plenty of journalists that were in touch with Jeffrey Epstein, so that's not notable. What is notable is that Michael Wolff was acting as a sort of strategist with Jeffrey Epstein. He advised him when to release certain information, how to respond to people. In one email, an ABC News representative reaches out to Jeffrey Epstein, and Michael Wolff says, don't take it, they'll do this and that. So this is way beyond the ethical boundaries that most journalists set up for talking with sources. The person who is less known but is actually probably more shocking is New York Times journalist Landon Thomas Jr. He used to work for the New York Times up until 2019, and he had an extremely close, sort of an advisor situation with Jeffrey Epstein where he would ask Epstein for input on certain things. In one email, he asked him for investment advice. On top of that, Landon Thomas tries to set up Jeffrey Epstein with Masayoshi Son, who is a Japanese-Korean billionaire. He's the head of SoftBank, which you might have heard of. They invest in some of the world's biggest companies. And they have this exchange where they go back and forth because Masayoshi Son's team doesn't trust Jeffrey Epstein. He's trying to put him in touch with them, but they're not having it. What's interesting about this dialogue is not just that it breaks all the ethical rules of journalism, but also that Jeffrey Epstein was not the one who initiated it. Landon Thomas was trying to connect Jeffrey Epstein with Masayoshi Son just out of the blue. So it's kind of puzzling why he would do that other than to try to gain currency with Jeffrey Epstein in some way. Regardless, he's no longer with the New York Times and he's doing freelance writing. You can look him up. The next piece is that Jeffrey Epstein made weird, rambling lists to himself. Sometimes they were for other people, like one said it was for Steve Bannon, but he sent several emails with lists of people that he knew to himself. Like this one, up at the top, we see various scientific concepts. They're totally removed of all context, so we have no idea. And then beneath them, we have lists of names. Among them are Bannon, Barack, Woody, Blaine, David Blaine, the magician, Thiel, Hoffman, and it doesn't stop there. There's plenty of other names listed in this email that would be very ripe for research, as well as weird, somewhat anatomical or medical descriptions at the bottom here. So there's a lot to go off of here if I was going to use any bit of this as an investigatory jumping off point, it would be this email. Moving along with this topic and the theme of Jeffrey Epstein and Steve Bannon sort of bouncing ideas off of each other, Steve Bannon, in the middle of discussing a documentary that they planned to make about Jeffrey Epstein, says, "You are a lot of things which we will show, but you are not that. You are not unredeemable." He says, "We must counter who traffics in female children to be by world's most powerful, richest men, that you can't be redeemed. That is why we let them blow up the argument while showing the 12 you did redeem." Now, I would love to know who Steve Bannon thinks Jeffrey Epstein redeemed. However, this documentary that they made or were working on really until the day that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested has never been released, and Steve Bannon has not provided really any details on it. Probably because the email interactions between them have been so unflattering to Steve Bannon's public image. Now, we said that Jeffrey Epstein was highly involved in international events. He knew plenty of people in different countries, and he also knew tons of political figures from countries spanning the world. We see in this document that he appears to have known Labour Party politician in Norway, whose name is Thorbjørn Jagland. I'm probably botching that pronunciation, and I'm going to botch this one as well. He knows a man named Miroslav, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Slovak Republic. And this one is quite interesting. Jeffrey Epstein said that he was in the Élysée Palace. The person with which he's corresponding says, "With the Macron government?" And he says, "Yes, just two, entire place." The Élysée Palace is really the foremost political building in France. It's roughly equivalent to the White House in the United States. In one email, Jeffrey Epstein says he knows the president of Mongolia. In another, he writes Mohammed Ahid Hassan, the president of the Maldives. They go back and forth about a suspicious financial proposal that Hassan had received, and Jeffrey Epstein advises him not to continue with it. Next, Jeffrey Epstein advises the son of a Norwegian diplomat, whose name is Edward Rod Larson. He's a college student. He advises him on a college admissions essay, which really just goes to show how intimately he knew some of these people. He was advising their children on how to get into New York University. One of the most interesting emails in this batch is next. Jeffrey Epstein writes that Norwegian politician Thorbjørn Jagland, and he says, "I think you might suggest to Putin that Lavrov can get insight on talking to me. Vitaly Churkin used to, but he died," suggesting that Jeffrey Epstein was able to provide information on Donald Trump to the Russians. Then Jagland says that he will suggest Jeffrey Epstein's advice to Lavrov's assistant. Lavrov is one of these Russian figures that you've probably seen if you followed the Ukraine coverage at all. He's very shrewd, and behind Putin, he's really one of Russia's foremost representatives on the world stage. You hear more from Lavrov than you do from most Russian politicians. Whatever the case, Jeffrey Epstein says that Churkin, before he died, was great. He understood Trump after our conversations, so he says that he did pass along information about Donald Trump to Vitaly Churkin. And you have to ask yourself, what was in it for Jeffrey Epstein to provide this information to the Russians? This is just another one of those loose threads where it's impossible to tell if Jeffrey Epstein is posturing, making up information, or if he's serious. In the next email, Jeffrey Epstein is conversing with Larry Summers, and he says that he knew the son of the president of Senegal. He says, quote, "Karim Wade is the son of the president of Senegal. He is well educated and one of the most important figures in West Africa. However, full disclosure, he was put in jail to remove him from running against the current president. He's in Qatar awaiting his political return to power, which is almost guaranteed. He is the most charismatic and rational of all the Africans and has their respect." Jeffrey Epstein's account of this man turned out not to be accurate. He did try to run for president, however, that did not work out. This email from Gwendolyn Beck, who was an advisor to Donald Trump and is married to Robert Menendez, whose name you might recall, he's a senator who was convicted of taking bribes. They sent a few emails back and forth, and she says that Tom McMillan, who was a United States representative, also knew Jeffrey Epstein back in the 90s. We can see in this document that Jeffrey Epstein seems to have known the governor of the Virgin Islands. In this next document, Jeffrey Epstein claims to know the leader of Qatar, HBJ, whose name is too long and difficult for me to pronounce. However, Jeffrey Epstein says that he is his Arab brother. Before we wrap up this section, there's a very interesting email that Jeffrey Epstein sent to Tom Barak, who is the current ambassador to Turkey. Jeffrey Epstein says, "Send photos of you and child. Make me smile." It's a strange email for anybody to send to anybody, really, but especially strange coming from Jeffrey Epstein. Barack has 6 children, so it's not really clear who he was referring to or what their age was. The next interesting bit is that Jeffrey Epstein was heavily advising several Israeli politicians. We knew that he and Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, were quite close, but Jeffrey Epstein's relationship with him seems to go much deeper. In one email, Jeffrey Epstein begins editing an op-ed written by Ehud Barak, and he suggests that Ehud Barak downplay the, quote, gassing of women and children. He says that it's outdated, and he should use the term civilians versus combatants. Then there are multiple scans of a speech given by Ehud Barak to AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which has been in the news quite extensively recently. On top of that, Jeffrey Epstein received a periodic newsletter called the Shimon Press from Shimon Peres, the former prime minister of Israel. This newsletter said, Presidential Press Bulletin, beneath a small illustration. These illustrations changed, and there's multiple of these bulletins sent to Jeffrey Epstein, but the depth of their relationship is not exactly clear. Next, we have emails showing some sort of relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Peter Thiel, that notable venture capitalist, probably the most famous venture capitalist in America, and a guy who's been in the news quite frequently recently. I will say the tone of their emails is not quite as friendly as some of the other people that are in this load of documents. However, there are several emails between and about them. The first of which is an email between Kathy Rumler, that Obama counsel that I talked about, and Jeffrey Epstein. Kathy Rumler says most girls don't have to worry about this crap, talking about business transactions and things like that. Jeffrey Epstein says, girls, careful, I will renew an old habit. Next, he says, this week, Thiel, Summers, Bill Burns, Gordon Brown, Yaglin, Mongolia Prez, Hardeep Puri, Boris, Jabor, Sultan of Dubai, Koslin from Harvard, Leon Black, and Woody. You are a welcome guest at any. Also, if you think there are interesting people in town, everyone is here for a climate summit. Epstein has this weird way of writing that makes it kind of hard to decipher what exactly he means. He's just inviting Kathy Rumler to any meeting, and one of these meetings is with Peter Thiel. 4 years later, in 2018, Jeffrey Epstein writes Peter Thiel, says, are you enjoying LA? I liked your Trump exaggerations, not lies, apparently referring to something that Peter Thiel had said at the 2018 DealBook conference. According to this article, Thiel said, I tend to think that the inaccuracies President Trump tells are basically exaggerations of the truth. He added lying is just politics. And Jeffrey Epstein complimented him on this line. Peter Thiel responded to that and said, I can't complain about LA thus far. Jeffrey Epstein responds, December, visit me in the Caribbean. However, whether Peter Thiel responded to this is not clear. Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein knew each other for quite a few years. It's not exactly clear how many, but at least 4 to 5. Back in 2014, Epstein asks Peter Thiel, any interest in Woody Allen? Peter Thiel says, it would be cool to meet him sometime, but don't go out of the way to make this happen. Are we planning something the weekend of the 13th to 14th? To which Epstein responds, 13th afternoon, you and I. Next, there's some allusion by Jeffrey Epstein to still being in touch with Donald Trump, and other people allude to this as well. In this first email, someone whose name is redacted reaches out to Jeffrey Epstein to ask if someone that he knows who works for the Ukrainian opposition leader could attend Donald Trump's inauguration. It's not exactly clear how Jeffrey Epstein would be able to sway this particular situation in her favor at all, but this person, whoever they are, seems to think that he has the power to do so. In 2013, Jeffrey Epstein receives an invite to a party for the New York Observer, which is a newspaper that's now defunct, but was owned by Jared Kushner, who is married to Donald Trump's daughter. That invite also says that Donald Trump will be in attendance. Now, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, the main story about Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein is that they hated each other and that they wouldn't speak to each other after a certain point. However, this is a great many years after whatever rift the mainstream news talks about, and here is Jeffrey Epstein receiving a VIP invitation to one of Donald Trump's son-in-law's parties. Jeffrey Epstein sends this email to Lawrence Krauss asking scientific questions about, global warming and climate change. But he says, "I'm here with the Trump people in Palm. And when asked, I say I don't have any idea if this global warming is a threat that can be reduced." Krauss doesn't ask about Trump at all. They continue talking about global warming almost as though the interaction between them is not notable in the slightest. The global warming stuff is besides the point. That's not interesting. What is interesting is that this is December 24th, 2016, Christmas Eve 2016, and Jeffrey Epstein is talking about being in Palm Beach, where both he has a house and Donald Trump has a house at Mar-a-Lago. Also in 2016, Jeffrey Epstein says, "I'm in Palm with the Trump crowd for Thanksgiving." A few days before that, on November 13th, 2016, Jeffrey Epstein says that he is in Trump Tower. If you've watched this channel before, you'll know that one of the theories that I have regarding Jeffrey Epstein is that he may have had biological children during his lifetime, and I was very surprised to see further evidence of those efforts in these emails. On December 31st, 2012, Jean-Luc Brunel, who is one of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged co-conspirators, he had a modeling business in France that supposedly was used to traffic girls between nations. He writes to Jeffrey Epstein and says, "All the best in the new year, for more fun in the new year, and for little Jeffrey soon to come," with a winking face. Epstein doesn't say anything about this, but Jean-Luc Brunel the next day at 12:51 a.m. writes, "I saved for 2012, but I can start to look for baby clothes if the wish turns into reality. Or would you stick with RL Baby around the corner? I forgot that you are planning everything." The next revelation is really one of those things that we all kind of knew, but this kind of deepens our understanding of it, which is that Jeffrey Epstein was a prolific connector of people. He almost was like a web. He collected so many people in his proximity and was constantly putting people in touch with other people. And I'm very curious as to why he felt like he had to do this. This person, who is the CEO of Coach, says Jeffrey Epstein set him up to meet Sultan bin Sulayem, that business leader from Qatar. He's also arranging dinners with someone who is possibly Steve Bannon and that Slovak diplomat. Next, we have the relationship between Larry Summers, and he's taken leave at Harvard because of emails that he exchanged with Jeffrey Epstein. Several of these emails were regarding an extramarital relationship that he intended to pursue with someone to whom he was a mentor. Larry Summers says, "I think for now I'm going nowhere with her except economics mentor. I think I'm right now in the seen very warmly in the rearview mirror category. She must be very confused, or maybe wants to cut me off, but wants professional connection a lot and so holds to it." This woman may have been Ki-Yu Jin, who is a Harvard alumni and professor at the London School of Economics. They text about her quite a lot, and what's interesting is that she is the daughter of a highly prominent Chinese economist and politician. She emails Larry Summers asking for feedback on a paper, and Larry Summers forwards it to Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein responds, "She's already beginning to sound needy. Nice," with a smiley face. Now, if you'll forgive me for a moment giving my opinion on these are not messages, to be honest, that seem like they're sent between colleagues or acquaintances. These are the types of topics that you discuss with friends, close friends. And the second thing to note about this trove of documents, maybe I'm just an old-timey country rube, but the ease with which many of these people cheat on each other is astounding. In many cases, it seems as though the spouse knows about it and yet does nothing about it. So that's just an interesting observation that I made, and it's very hard to believe. As I was going through these files, I tried to organize them by topic, but there were a couple things of interest that didn't fit neatly into any of the categories I had set out. So we'll go through these rapid fire in the also of interest category. Number one in this file, Jeffrey Epstein talks about that Clinton painting with some anonymous person. I believe that this may have been the Bill Clinton in the blue dress painting that's completely infamous now for Jeffrey Epstein having owned it. He says, "Put it out on display, quote, so that people walking by can smile." Next, we have Peter Attia, who is a longevity expert. He was recently profiled on 60 Minutes. I just watched him after football one Sunday night. He writes back and forth with Jeffrey Epstein and seems to have been close with him. Speaking of close, Jeffrey Epstein and David Blaine, the famous magician, planned dinner with Woody Allen. Next, we have these weird screenshots of various pieces of Trump brand merchandise. There are Donald Trump necktie photos and other collectibles from eBay. I have no idea what the significance of this was. Were these owned by Jeffrey Epstein? Was he trying to purchase them? I have no idea. They're removed of all context. Next, there are construction plans for a building at 320 East 82nd Street received by Jeffrey Epstein. I have no idea what his affiliation is with these. He lives 10 blocks away on 71st Street, 11 blocks, but it's not a building that I know that Jeffrey Epstein ever owned, so I'm not quite sure what the connection is there. The next email is from Joshua Bach, who is, one of these guys that has every credential that you could possibly hope for. He's worked at MIT, Harvard, Intel, but he's also extraordinarily close with Jeffrey Epstein. They share scientific thoughts, and Joshua Bach actually sends very weird emails about race science to Jeffrey Epstein. He advocates in this email for executions of the elderly and making children more expensive to deal with overpopulation. And he says, regarding taboo topics, maybe climate change is a good way of dealing with overpopulation, the Earth's forest fire, potentially a good thing for the species. Making having children expensive in terms of upbringing and missed opportunity, like in the West, is a more humane way. Environmental stress while leaving near rock bottom tends to lead people to have more children because there's no missed opportunity, and high mortality requires more attempts at procreation. Humans are a hardy species outside of focused famine events and wars. Only small fractions of any given population die. Further down, there's too many people. So many mass executions of the elderly and infirm make sense. Is the fundamental fact that everyone dies at some time make it impossible to ask, so why not earlier? If the brain discards unused neurons, why should society keep their equivalent? Joshua Bach is a German. Perhaps you should look a little bit more into the history of German leaders that pursued similar propositions. Well, if you listened to 46 minutes so far of information, I really appreciate you. I tried to make it as concise as possible. However, there's so much here, I'd almost be negligent if I left some of this stuff out. There are a few maybe less important things that I didn't get to cover. You're welcome to look through all of my findings. I've linked them in the description in a public Google Doc. And I thank you very much for watching. Congress recently passed that Epstein files disclosure bill. I'm not going to hold my breath for its release because that's the way that things have been going. However, if it does get released, you already know I'll be here reading it all. Thank you so much for watching.